Hello and welcome back to the channel. This is going to be quite an interesting review, I think, because it's going to compare two different models at two different price points. Now, this is a 1992 Ford Escort RS Cosworth, or two models of said car. A little bit of information about the Escort RS Cosworth. It was made in fairly limited numbers, sold only in Europe, and it was a rally car for the road. So it's part of that sort of 1990s turbo four-wheel drive hatchback sort of peak of these types of vehicles. This was made purely for motorsport. They had to make road legal versions. The road version had about 227 horsepower. It was a pretty quick car back in the day, but it had endless tuning potential, and really the car was designed to run at about 350 horsepower. And had to be detuned for the road just to make it a bit more civilized. And of course, there was no need for having much more power than sort of 200 odd horsepower for the road use anyway. Naturally, people got the tuning bug on these cars, and very few cars have remained standard, even when they were just a few years old. Tuning companies were already tuning these cars up to 400 or 500 horsepower, and the amount of information about what these cars were like and what they could do is certainly for all to see if you actually look into the history of this car. Now, these models are made by two different manufacturers, and not just because they're two different colours. So you've got a model here made by Minichamps, which is a very well-known, very common brand. It's a relatively new model. They've only been out for a few years. And it is actually based on an earlier model which used to be made by UT. Now, UT went out of production a long time ago, and I believe Minichamps bought the molds and the tooling, so they've actually got the same body, exact same body that the UT models would have come with sort of 20 odd years ago. And what they've done is simply updated some of the detailing, sort of bring it up to sort of a slightly more modern standard, but it's essentially the same model, just with a few updates. Now, this one here, over here, this one is made by Otto, which is a French manufacturer, and these models are made of resin. So you've got die-cast resin and you've got die-cast metal. Now, there is a big difference in price point. The Otto resin model is significantly more expensive than the Minichamps. The question is it worth the extra money? The Minichamps one are generally around 50-60 pounds. These automobiles are at least double the price. They weren't so much when they were new, but because of the rarity of these, as they're made in limited numbers, they're now quite expensive to buy. They did do a re-release recently, and I believe it was available in a Pacific or Pacifica blue, or may have been Imperial blue, which is a colours that only the Escort Cosworth came in real life. But these models are all limited editions, and they tend to get sold out almost immediately. I bought this on pre-order. Can't remember for how much for now, but it was probably 8, 9, 10 years ago or something. It's been kept in pristine condition because, like all my models, they're kept locked away in a glass cabinet and away from sticky little hands of kids and what have you, and pets. So they tend to be in as new condition, and I have all the original boxes for them all locked away in the attic. So this particular car is number 914 of 1500. That is 1500 models produced in the entire world. So that's what adds to the value of these, just the rarity. The lower the number, generally the more expensive the model becomes, because I've got some other ones which are produced in even fewer numbers, which are even more expensive now. But looking around this model, being a resin model, the detail is really sharp, really accurate, but there's certain things about this model which I really like. So looking at things like the wheels are absolutely spot on to scale to the real car. That is exactly what they would look like on the real car. The original car had a 16/8 wheel, and looking at the proportions of this, if you took a photograph of an Escort Cosworth, looked at it side by side, that is what it's going to look like. That is absolutely spot on in every way. The whale tail, the way it dips across at the top slightly here, it's just like the real car. Exactly what you'd want to see. Looking around the back, the way the spoiler goes out, it looks like it goes out extremely far, but that's what the real car looked like. It's just interesting when you're looking at it in a 1/18 scale. And another thing about these resin models is the paintwork tends to be really good. So looking down the side of that, the reflections on that, I mean, if that was a real car, you'd be pretty happy with a paint job like that. It is absolutely pristine, no orange peel, no blemishes, no sort of manufacturing faults or anything. The paintwork is almost looks like glass. I mean, that is so shiny, so glossy. It's absolutely brilliant, really. I think it's fantastic. Other little things about these models is the thin, very, very thin glass. It's obviously very thin plastic. Makes it very delicate. You have to be a little bit careful with these because you can easily put your finger through the windscreen or the sunroof, but it makes everything very sharp. You can look through there and you can see how easily you can view the interior. There's no distortion looking through. It's absolutely spot on. Speaking of the interior, as you've got no opening parts, it's a bit of a shame, but that's the downside of these resin models. But looking at it, you can see a lot of detail there. You can see even like the gear stick, it's got its 1 to 5 gears labelled on there quite nicely. You've got the seat belts, you've got the turbo gauges on the dashboard. Try and zoom in on those, a little bit difficult, but if it focuses, here we go. So you can see the turbo little white dials on top of the bonnet, on top of the dashboard right there, what they used to call the banana pod. You can see the white dials in the dashboard. So overall, a really nice level of detail. So I think, well, it is the best you're going to get if you're after a model of a Ford Escort Cosworth. There's only a couple of manufacturers that make them, and I don't know of any others apart from Minichamps and Otto, and this is without doubt the best quality model, the best detailed model you're going to get for this particular car. So if we move on to the Minichamps version, let's have a look and see how this one compares. So straight off the bat, something's not quite right about this car. I think when you look at that, I think there's something not quite right, and I'll tell you what it is. It's the wheels. If you look at the wheels, they appear to be much narrower. Look at the ones on the Otto, and you can see there's a lot of depth in those wheels, and the real car, the wheels were very wide, 8-inch wide for a little car. That's actually pretty big, quite modest by today's standard, but they did look very wide and squat, and the wheels added to that. These wheels look very flat. They don't really look that much like the actual wheels that came on the Escort Cosworth. Looking at the side profile, the side profile's pretty good, but I think there's a few things they've got wrong. I think the spoiler doesn't come out far enough. It doesn't have a little dovetail on the back. Well, it's not as pronounced as it is on the Otto one. I think the Otto one's pretty accurate. The shape of the door here, I think it curves in a little bit too much. I don't think that's quite right. The front's not so bad. Like the wings look pretty accurate. The way the arches are shaped is pretty good. But there's one really glaringly obvious thing that's wrong on the front. That front grille is pretty enormous. If I zoom in on that. Oh, that's not zooming. That's the opposite. There you go. That grille is enormous. And also, I don't know if you spotted it, some muppet put the Ford badge on upside down. I mean, that's just you know, I mean, what excuse have they got for that? I mean, that's just a joke, really. But it is a budget model. I could always get a little sticker and replace that, I suppose, but I think it shows the difference between the quality. Now, coming back to this grille is nothing like the real car. That grille that's exactly what the front grille of an Escort Cosworth looks like. And I think where they got this wrong is some of the very early editions that were given to the rally teams, which were not production cars, had a large open grille like this. And I think they've looked at pictures of those when they were developing the tooling for this car way back when it was a UT, and they've come up with the wrong grille. So it's got the front grille of a very early production rally car rather than the road car. Now, even the rally cars only had this type of grille. It's probably on a very few handful of cars that had this front grille. The rest of the road cars and rally cars had a grille just like that because they were basically the same as the road car, apart from all the modifications to the engine suspension. The bodies were completely unmodified. Every last detail of the body remained on the rally car. All they would do is the roll cage, the engine tuning, rally wheels, all that kind of stuff, but they all had the same bumpers, bonnets, doors, wings, arches, spoilers, they were identical. So that's wrong. So straight away, that's something which is, I think, a pretty big flaw with this car. Looking around it though, the paint's pretty good on these. I think it's a nice sort of shade of gloss metallic black. You can't really see the black metallic in there, but it is metallic. And when you look around it, I mean, the paint's pretty good. You've got good reflections on there. There's not really any imperfections in the paint. It doesn't look quite as sharp as the paint on the red one. The red one, the paint almost looks like glass. But I'd have to say, I think the paint quality is pretty good. I think the Minichamps models, they've always been a bit hit and miss, and some of them the paint isn't amazing. I think the paint on this is pretty good. It's not perfect. There are some blemishes when you look up close. You can see some sort of spidery sort of defects in the paint, but it's not terrible. I've seen an awful lot worse, but it does look quite nice and shiny and presents quite well. Now, one of the big differences on this one is you've got some opening features. So I'm just going to open it up, if you bear with me a second. There we go, all open now. Now this is where I can't really do a comparison with the Otto because there's nothing to see, nothing to open. So under the bonnet, you've got really kind of very average detail. I mean, it's got all the stickers, it's got the badges, it's got all the sort of bits under the bonnet, but they're very basic. I mean, there's no sort of real depth of detail there. I mean, I think the engine isn't actually an actual sort of separate piece. I think it's just one molded plug for the whole section of what's under the bonnet, and just with the individual painted details. I mean, it looks good. If you open it up from a distance, it doesn't look bad. I mean, it looks okay, but I think when you get in close, it's not amazing. But it's okay. Rather, it opens than nothing at all. Looking around the inside of the car, the interior doesn't look too bad from here, but it is just a sea of plastic, sea of grey plastic, I might add, which is a bit of a shame really, because the model over there, the red one, the interior on that is far more accurate, much more detailed. Actually, interesting thing I've noticed is this one has got a later steering wheel, because that would have had an airbag on the real car, and it's actually moulded to look pretty accurate to the real thing. The other car seems to be one that doesn't have an airbag, because it's got a different type of steering wheel, which is correct for a very early Escort Cosworth. They wouldn't have had an airbag. So this is probably based on a 94 or a 95, which would have had an airbag. So there are a few little differences between the cars. But the interior here is a real letdown, I think. You've got all this moulded plastic, virtually no detail. I mean, this could be so much improved just by a bit of paint on the speaker covers and on the handles. I mean, the moulding isn't all that great as well. It's got a few blemishes. And then inside, it's just lots of plastic. Again, things like these, you know, on the other one, you've even got the painted hazard warning light. That doesn't even exist in this car. It would be over here on top of behind the steering wheel. That one's got a little orange warning light. This has not even got the actual mould for it. So the interior is not terrible, but it's really lacking in detail. Now you could take this apart sorry, and hand paint it yourself, and you know, I think there's a lot you could do to improve it. You could flock the carpet, you could put detailing on the door cards, you could really improve the model enormously, but is it really worth it? I'm not sure. So overall, in conclusion, I think depends how much of a fan you are of this car. If you're a die-hard Ford RS fan, then I think this is the only model to have. I don't think there's any decision to make. If your pockets allow it, I think without a doubt, go for the Otto. It's better in every single way. The opening features are more sort of features you'd expect on a toy anyway, which might amuse a child, but I think for an adult collector, you don't really need the opening features. I think, you know, this model just looks great sitting on a shelf. It looks like the real car. The detailing is very good. The paint's flawless, the proportions are flawless, the wheels look just spot on, the lights look spot on, the glass looks realistic. Everything about it is, I think, just fault free. You can't really, you know, knock this model. I think it's as good as you're going to get. Now this one here, I think if you're not that much into Fords and just fancied having maybe an Escort RS in your collection, it's a good model to have. Good, definitely a nice one to have. Definitely a massive improvement over the earlier UT models, but I would think If you're not a massive Ford fan, you just have a sort of vague interest in these cars, I'd recommend buying that one. So in conclusion, if you're a fast Ford fan, have that one. If you're a fast Ford freak, which I am a little bit, I hate to admit it, that's the one to have. So you pay your monies, you make your choices, and do whatever makes you happy. But thank you very much for tuning into this review. I hope you found it useful. If you're thinking of buying one of these models, hopefully this gives you a very detailed and in-depth review of what these cars are like. And then if you are going to buy one, you can choose which one suits you best. And if you do go for the newer version of this one, the Otto one, which doesn't come in red anymore, the blue colour, or whatever the colour they've launched it in, the detail and everything else will be absolutely identical to this. The only thing that's going to be different is the colour. So if you do like the look of this and the detail, I'd suggest, even if you can't get the red, maybe go for the blue. I don't think you regret it. I think it's definitely one to keep, and certainly one which is going to increase in value. And if you ever decide to get rid of your collection, you can't really lose money on these particular models. So anyway, thanks again for tuning in, and please keep an eye out for more videos.